And now, dear ladies and gentlemen, our first panel deals with diplomacy in dialogue with history. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Tomasz Cebulski and introduced by Professor Joanna Dyduch. The title of the lecture is Complexity of the Contemporary Polish-Israeli Relations Between Sentimentality and Pragmatism. Professor Joanna Dyduch is affiliated with the Institute of the Middle and Far East Studies at the Jagiellonian University. Professor Dyduch, the floor is yours.
Welcome and thank you very much. Let me start with this technical issue. I just wanted to share my presentation, which will help me a little bit to navigate us through through my very short, but I hope full of content lecture. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored, but also I must say that this occasion and the audience, we have already 150 viewers from representing Polish media, Polish and Israeli media, Polish and Israeli academia, diplomats, and colleagues, analysts, scholars, but also I've noticed having a quick look on the list of attendees, of participants, that there are a number of people whom I met over the 2 decades of my own, let's say, journey or my own experience, which I would name or term Polish-Israeli relations. My today's presentation, which is limited to 20 minutes, I guess already like 90 minutes, is aiming to reflect not on the historical evolution of Polish-Israeli relations, but rather to conceptualize or to answer a question: where are we now? And to name or to identify or today's stage of Polish-Israeli relation. I tend to think about Polish-Israeli relation for a number of years as an evolving phenomenon that is, in terms of the planes that it's taking place, somehow synchronized. What I mean, that of course we in 90s, we started with normalization of the relation. There was a lot of effort and there is a lot of effort on both sides to make the relations friendly, but also efficient on all kinds, in all kinds of dimensions, political, economic, of course, people-to-people contacts played a crucial role. Then I would say in the end of 90s, at the end of 90s, beginning of 2000s, especially in the political narrative, we started to describe Polish-Israeli relations as strategic one, as a strategic partnership. This was of course related to both Polish and Israeli, but let me more focus on Polish perspective, but Polish orientation in foreign policy, which 2 main pillars were on one hand European integration, and on the other hand integration with with NATO. So this Atlantic orientation in terms of security policy played a crucial role. On the other hand, this a very important role in Polish strategy played attempt and then membership in the European Union. What it meant for the Polish-Israeli relations, basically, I would say it meant that these 2 pillars were somewhat somehow coherent. So there was no conflict between Atlanticism in Polish security policy and pro-European attitudes and efforts to join the European Union. Israel, of course, was observing this and was trying to gain as much as possible in terms of, in the relation with Poland, was looking for gaining a new, hopefully from the Israeli perspective, but Polish as well, influential partner on the international arena, especially the European one. Of course, Israel acknowledged the fact, and not only acknowledged, but also utilized somehow the fact that Poland, since beginning of 90s, but late 90s, beginning of 2000, consequently was trying to not only preserve but also strengthen relationship with the United States, and Polish policy, Middle Eastern policy, was very much coherent with the line of Washington. And as I said, everything was more or less coherent. That means that there was no tension between these pro-European and pro-Atlantic dimension of foreign policy. But things has changed. There were signals already in the beginning of 2000, but I would say in the second decade, in the beginning of the second decade of 2000, we see that it's more and more complicated to maintain this or to maintain in an efficient way these two directions of Polish foreign policy. That means that this pro-Atlantic orientation is not very, very well seen by our Western partners, Western European partners, which I would term for the purpose of this presentation, the Brussels Center, so the Brussels. But of course here, Germany and France plays a crucial role, and to this I will come back. So summing up, if we want to provide any kind of a brief diagnosis of Polish-Israeli relations today, I would say that Polish-Israeli relation is not normalization, is not in a stage of normalization, and nor in the stage of strategic partnership. I wouldn't say that Polish-Israeli relations are in crisis, but it's a challenge for us scholars, but not only scholars, but also analysts, but also activists, diplomats, and so on, to understand where are we now. And in order to understand it, I believe we need to identify the most, the crucial and the most powerful and influential factors shaping Polish-Israeli relations. And for the purpose of this presentation, I've tried to do it. I know that this is something that needs to be continued. The work, this study needs to be continued and needs a really in-depth reflection. But let me just point out a couple of few factors which I identify as key factors with regard to shaping the dynamic of Polish-Israeli relations. Most of them are related to the nature and character of contemporary international environment, international system. So what was already mentioned and very accurately pointed by Ambassador Ben-Zvi. So multilateralism or multilateralization of bilateral relations, which is also a fact for, and which is also true for Polish-Israeli relations, in terms of Polish-Israeli relation, is a dilemma between Europeanization and Atlanticism, as said. So now let me stop for a moment on these two directions of Polish-Israeli relations, of these two dimensions of Polish-Israeli relations from the Polish perspective, very important for conceptualization and operationalization of Israeli politics. So on one hand, as said, after joining the European Union, Polish foreign policy towards, or the Polish policy towards Israel was a part of wider Europeanization experience. Membership resulted with observable reassessment of the Poland's approach to Israel. The Europeanization of Polish attitude towards Israel resulted with decreasing willingness among the new member states, including Poland. Poland played here a very important role to provide international support for Israel and its conflict, and for Israel in the context of its conflict with Palestinians. That means that the wishes that were or the hopes formulated by Israeli diplomats and the Israeli political elite right before the accession of Central Eastern European states to accession to European Union, it turned that the new member states actually did not provide a substantive support for Israel within the European Union with regard to the conflict with Palestinians. Rather, tried to, and this was the case of Poland, tried to balance its position. And its term in the literature, the approach of Central Eastern European states, including Poland, is termed in the literature the policy of equal distance, which substituted its previous pro-Arab policy after the end of the Cold War. Simultaneously, Polish diplomacy made it clear that its aspiration to promote Israeli-European relations should be developed and pursued in the line with the EU preferred solution in the Middle East. What are the EU preferred solution in the Middle East? So basically, in short, without going into detail, there are two aspects. One aspect is a two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the second aspect is, and therefore, the occupation of the West Bank, Israeli occupation of the West Bank is illegal, entirely illegal. So what we observed right after the accession, I would say till 2011, 2015, Poland started, or in a quite of an evolving manner, was closer and closer to the Brussels perception. Of course, this has been noticed by Israelis by Israel and Israelis, and it caused some kind of disappointment. Things has changed, I would say, not in a revolutionary manner, but things started to change already in 2009, when Benjamin Netanyahu came to power for the first time, when he assumed prime minister office in 2009, and his policy towards Palestinians was caused criticism from Brussels and the Western capitals. Central Eastern European states and Poland tried to preserve quite a neutral stance as much as it was possible. But in a certain moment, it wasn't possible anymore. That means that the pressure from the Western capitals, like from mainly or mostly from France, but also from Sweden, Ireland, Belgium, caused a certain tension without the European Union. And Central Eastern European states, Poland less, but still, was accused not to understand the European values, not to understand the consensus-seeking culture of the European Union, and blocking and Polish, but even more Czech, Romanian, or Hungarian position was seen as a result, a consequence of the Europeanization of the foreign policy. In other words, this is something that is proved by the empirical research. I mean that de-Europeanization of the foreign policy of the Central Eastern European states is actually followed by renationalization of the foreign policy, which goes together with prioritizing of national interests, which goes together with seeking for diversification of multilateral of contacts beyond European Union and outside the European Union. And here I would say we come to this to the point of Atlanticism. Atlanticism as a counterbalance for lack of assurance from the European side for the Central Eastern European state security. Of course, Poland as well. So when we think of how this pro-Atlantic orientation influenced Polish-Israeli relations, I would say I would quote here one of I would recall a quotation from the interview I conducted recently in 2019 for the purpose of my research, where one of my interlocutors said, Poland tries to be careful and consider Americans' Middle Eastern policy, their views and argument. It has a lot to do with Poland's security strategy. This mechanism applies to relation and position towards Israel as well. So Polish Middle Eastern policy, which is very much, which has been in previous times very much influenced by European Union, or tend to be more and more influenced by the fact of the membership, started to be again much more influenced by the close relation with the United States. What does it mean? It means that Poland does not pay too much attention. Polish diplomacy does not pay too much attention to Middle East. Middle East is not a priority for Polish, a priority region for Polish foreign policy. And if it thinks about the Middle East, and if it's define its Middle Eastern policy, then it does it through the lens of cooperation with the United States. What can happen apart from bringing the parties like Poland and Israel together due to the Atlantic orientation, we will have a side effect of which I would name tensions, or a side effect which is a tension on the European Union level. Yeah. How much time do I have? I'm sorry, Eva.
Maybe we can go to conclusions.
Yes, we can. I'm absolutely there. So, so these are conclusions actually. So this trying to look at the relation between Poland as a country, as a state, as a play actor in international relations, and Israel as well, rather than Poles and Israelis from the social perspective, I would say what plays a role now is national interest, which is, this vision of national community, the importance of states is very sometimes performed and the contrary to liberal values. So what happens both in Israel and in Poland, national community and national interests matters more than anything else, sometimes more than long-lasting strategic cooperation with other partners. I posted here a question, does the economy really matter? If we say maybe it should, if the pragmatic relations are what we were really looking for, but looking into details, and I'm sure that representatives of Polish embassy, Polish diplomats, but not only Polish, but also Israeli diplomats would prove that in the broader context, European-Israeli context, Polish-Israeli economic exchange is not sharing a great portion of the exchange in terms of trade and investment. That means that economy does not really matter for Poland and Israel. That means also that high politics does not really matter in terms of direct relations. It matters for the indirect relation and the international context. The last question I'm going to leave as a really closing word. And here, what I try to do in conclusion, I have identified three main trends of international relations, of contemporary international relations, which impact the Polish-Israeli relation. One is the contestation of multilateralism. The second one is the securitization of the public policies. And the third one is extreme pragmatism, which means that we are prioritizing the own subjective and subjectively defined national interests. And this applies both for Israel and both for Poland. What does it mean for two parties? It means that the space for strategic long-lasting alliances is shrinking. So now Poland and Israel, but broadly states are not seeking for long-lasting friendship and alliances, rather the cooperation that brings a certain outcomes defined in terms of realpolitik. Then what the observable increase of securitization of public policies, where everything can become a security matters like health, absolutely everything, any kind of narrative, any kind of public policy can become a security matter. Even culture can become a security issue. When everything becomes a security issue, what happens then? We have, again, shrinking space for pluralism and consensual style of doing things. So we will have less and less space for mutual dialogue. And this extreme pragmatism will result with lack of trust. What we can do, of course, we have to do what this initiative of the conference is manifesting. We should really struggle for civil society, support the civil society activities. We should promote people-to-people interactions, and we should really still work and look for shared universal values and norms, which are not necessarily, I want to be understood, and this is my really last sentence, I'm not against nation state at all. I think this is something that nobody will, for a long time, will find nothing that can replace nation state in international relations. But the orientation in policies of the nations that in international relation needs to be a consensus-seeking culture. So I promise to say one more, and if you let me, will you let me? Probably we will continue in a discussion. There are two things which, from my perspective, does not play any role in current Polish-Israeli relations. They are somehow hidden, but they will play a role. They might play a role when some elites, some political actors will decide to politicize them. One is an issue of Polish passports carried by Israelis or obtaining by Israelis. We all know the numbers are quite significant already. And Polish passports, as Sharon Pardy was joking some months ago, is a fundamental need of Israelis when they were standing under COVID, when COVID in April started, when the lockdown related to COVID started, Israelis were standing in a long queue to Polish consulate in order to submit the documents. This is something that completely does not exist in the bilateral dialogue, narrative, whatever, but it might become an issue. A second thing is that is sometimes here and there recalled, and is a huge issue in Polish-Israeli relation and broader Polish-Jewish relation, is the property claims. But I believe that also our participants has something to do, has something to say about it. But there is no climate today, and there is no relevant. We cannot even identify parties who could or actors who could really discuss the issue as an issue in Polish-Israeli relations. So thank you very much for your patience. I have to finish here, and I'm happy for continuation in our panel discussion.
Thank you, Professor Dyduch, for your lecture, and thank you also for all your questions. We are going to collect them, and Dr. Tomasz Cybulski, who is the moderator of the first panel, is going to use to ask some of them later on after the panel. So thank you very much once again for all your questions. And now, please welcome Dr. Tomasz Cybulski, the moderator of the first panel. Dr. Cybulski is graduate of International Relations and Institute of the Middle and Far East Studies at the Jagiellonian University. He holds a PhD in the field of political studies, author of scientific and popular science articles dealing with the issues of the politics of memory, identity, and genocide studies. Dedicated museum guide, author of the book Auschwitz After Auschwitz, on the formation of memory around the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Tomasz, please, let's start.
Myself. Welcome once more, Your Excellencies and distinguished guests. It's a pleasure and privilege to moderate the first conference panel titled Diplomacy in Dialogue with History. I would like to invite to this panel the four guests that I already see on the screen. Welcome. So the Polish ambassador to Israel, Mr. Marek Magierowski, thank you for being with us. A former Israeli ambassador to Poland, Mr. Tzvi Ravner, welcome. Director General of Israel Council on Foreign Relations and of World Jewish Congress Israel, Dr. Lawrence Weinbaum, welcome. And Professor Joanna Dyduch, who delivered this very compact but fascinating lecture, which gives us a slightly different perspective on our mutual relations and its future. After a millennium of Polish-Jewish relations, 72 years of Polish-Israeli relations, the last 30 years after renewal seem to be only a certain appendix to the bigger picture. Yet those 30 years are fundamental for understanding of where we are now, and I sincerely believe that they can become a certain role model of how two nations that derive themselves from a common cultural and geographical territory and ground can process contested history in order to build a better future. And my first question to the panelists, and I would like to each and every panelist to answer and tackle with this question, is what is the major obstacle in Polish-Israeli mutual relations, and how it can be overcome by both partners, especially an obstacle for the year 2020. And I would kindly ask Ambassador Magierowski to provide us with an answer.
I just had to unmute myself. Thank you. Let me start with an anecdote. As you probably know, I used to be a journalist for over 20 years, and I keep devouring news. I'm addicted to this world. And for the last few months, I've been following the coverage of the coronavirus in the Israeli media. During the first wave, whenever journalists and experts were talking about the pandemic situation in Europe, they used to mention Spain, Italy, or Belgium as examples of countries which were apparently collapsing. And on the other hand, they pointed at Germany or Austria as those which were coping pretty well with the pandemic. There were charts, maps, statistics, live reporting from Paris, Brussels, Rome, everything labeled as Europe. But quite oddly, they never, ever mentioned Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, or Lithuania. The fact that those countries were also dealing relatively well with the pandemic. However, in the world of the Israeli media, they are plainly not Europe. Europe ends somewhere on the outskirts of Berlin. But during the second wave, Poland, Romania, and Czechia miraculously became European. Charts, maps, and statistics were shown on Israeli TV to prove that these European countries found themselves in a shambles. In brief, Eastern European countries are worth reporting on when there is something wrong with them. Eastern Europe is not worth reporting and basically does not exist when something good and positive occurs in Poland, Croatia, or Bulgaria. I'm not going to blame the Israeli journalists for that. It's the legacy. My conclusion is as follows. We do remember when and why we re-established our diplomatic relations, but we tend to forget why we severed them in the first place. Poland and Israel were on the opposite sides of the Cold War rivalry between two political and ideological camps. We were separated by the Iron Curtain, not geographically, of course, because Israel is not located in Europe, but mentally. Poland was east, Israel was west. Before the pandemic, I spoke with dozens of Israelis who had visited Poland for the first time in their lives, 2 weeks or a month or 3 months before, and all but a few were saying to me, you know, I expected to see and to experience something completely different. A sad, drab, colorless, cold country with frustrating history and nationalistic tendencies. And what I saw after landing in Warsaw, Krakow, or Gdansk was a Western country in Eastern Europe. Modern, bustling, technologically advanced, and friendly. To put it bluntly, the legacy of communism is deeply rooted in the perception of Poland in Israel as post-communist and backward. And conversely, Israel is still perceived by many Poles as insecure, as a Middle East country. And you know pretty well what Middle East means. It means missiles, explosive suicide bombings, riots, ethnic and religious conflicts. Of course, these things do happen in Israel from time to time, as much as Poland can be sad and cold. But I would prefer to see more stories in the Israeli media about Polish video games and read more articles in the Polish newspapers about, for instance, the Israeli contemporary cinema, and not necessarily about fauda, in which and suicide bombings abound. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. The media coverage will be also discussed a little bit later, but this is a very precious remark. And now I'd like to ask the same question. So what are the obstacles in mutual Polish relations and how they can be overcome? The former ambassador, Mr. Zwiradna.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And it reminds me, the ambassador told an episode, so I will tell also a little story, which will lead to the question. In 1986, the communist government of Poland sent the late director of the Jewish theater, Szymon Szurmiej, to Israel on a secret diplomatic mission to talk about relations. He met with then Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir, himself born in Poland. And the problem was, I was the note taker, deputy director, I was a note taker. There were only the three of us. And Szurmiej wanted to speak in Polish. Itzhak Shamir said, well, my Polish is not so good, but what about Yiddish? And they started this diplomatic meeting in Yiddish. And since I had some knowledge of Yiddish, I was able to make the protocol correctly. And then I showed it to Shamir to be sure that this is, that I took the right notes about the meeting. So now, why am I telling this story apart from memories? Is that, to your question, we have, I think, good relations that were really detailed here by Professor Joanna, indeed. But obstacles, unfortunately, still I would say, historical and / Jewish issues. Because, and that this is rather surprising in a way, because the two countries are rather close in many fields, and it was manifested during those 30 years in any possible dimension, the security and economy and tourism that was mentioned here, and culture even, and politically, even though, yeah, sometimes with the European Union, as mentioned earlier, we had differences, but still, on the other hand, the cooperation within the framework of Visegrad 4, that Poland was quite active, and Israel joined in a way to this dialogue. So it was, and even ideologically, politically ideologically, we have quite same governments in Poland and Israel, right-wing, very pro-religion, but okay, not to exaggerate, not on abortions, thanks God. We have a little bit different policies, but in essence, these are right-wing governments that ideologically are quite close to each other. However, it's not the first time. The problems that we are we're having in the last 2 years on these obstacles, constituted these obstacles, the historical and Jewish questions, in a way came as a surprise, because you had in Poland right-wing governments before. The late Nieboszczyk Lech Kaczynski was the president, and his brother, a twin brother, was the prime minister, Jarosław Kaczynski. And we didn't have, to such an extent, controversies at that time. There were some arguments, there was always an argument, but not to this extent, and as in the last 2 years. Now, how to solve this problem indeed? I would say, as far as history is concerned, you know, when I was ambassador, it always surprised me when I was asked by several people, including journalists or academics, what is, not to mention politicians, what is the historical policy of the Israeli government? And I always surprised me, because I said, what is it, political, historical policy of the government? We don't have, we have historians, and each one is of course entitled to their own opinions about it. It's not a matter of policy. In 1984 of Orwell, there was a historical policy, but not in a, it shouldn't be in place in a democratic political environment. So I think we should leave the history to historians. About other Jewish issues like the property and unfortunately the initiative again of banning of the ritual slaughter in Poland, which is also again going to raise another obstacle soon if it happens. We better leave those questions, even the property, which is very difficult question indeed, but to deal less with the political aspects and more with the concrete, specific attempts of solutions, even with this property issue, to try and find what is possible, what is not possible, what is possible for Poland, what is not possible. To be real,
thank you very much.
Not sentimental and not controversial. If we manage to have less, to make these arguments less political and more historical, professional, candid, open. Arguments are okay. Arguments are okay. We should not be afraid of arguments and some sort of controversies, but they may lead to fruitful dialogue rather than to confrontation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Those are very important points. And now the same question about obstacles and how to overcome it is coming for Dr. Lorenz Weinbach.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I begin, I would just like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event. I know from my own experience what it is to put something like this together, and I just want to say that I admire their determination and their professionalism. I would also like to say something else, and that's a word of admiration for Marek Magierowski, who arrived in this country a couple of years ago, having received, well, we could say a very difficult set of cards, and has done an extraordinary job in diffusing tensions. I don't always agree with him, but I think he's been a model diplomat. His background is in journalism, but I think even all diplomatic professionals have a lot to learn. I'll put that in writing with a stamp on it, with my signature.
Can you please mute? Can you please mute Larry right now?
I think that I'm going to echo what our friend Spiro Avner has said. I think that the great challenge in the great obstacle to the improvement of our bilateral relations is really the historical legacy. And I think we're deluding ourselves to think, even for a moment, that we can somehow put that aside and only think about the future. I would argue that the ambiance, particularly in Poland, has changed somewhat. Why do I say that? I recall very well, it was about 2000, when I went with the late, great Miriam Makavia, with whom I had the great pleasure of working for many years on the Israel-Poland Friendship Association, to a lecture by Jan Tomasz Gross, who had just published his book, Neighbors. He had arrived in Israel, and the two of us went to hear him speak. And I said to her jokingly, after hearing this very chilling lecture, I don't think this is the best venue and the best time and place for us to attempt to increase our membership. Everyone having been under the impression of this, the terrible things that Gross had described. But I must tell you, I was entirely mistaken on that time, because I saw at the time that it had absolutely no effect in the level of relations. I think people on the Israeli side didn't react nearly as harshly as they did to what happened some years later. And to this, I'm referring the adoption of this very unfortunate piece of legislation with which we are all familiar. And I think the fact that that came from the top and the emotions ran very deep, I think it was an ill-considered move. And I think that the Polish side was quite surprised at how Israel and how the Jewish world reacted to this. So I think that if we look at the contacts between Israel and Poland, and I can say, having been a co-organizer of a number of big events with our colleagues at the Polish Institute for International Affairs, this just cannot be swept under the carpet. I think we have to say, yes, this is a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity. And I give you just one example. When we had our last bilateral meeting in February of this year, just before the onset of COVID, we decided we must tackle this so-called elephant in the room immediately. In other words, we can't pretend that this historical baggage doesn't exist. And so the first session of a very long conference dealt with these historical challenges. I completely agree with Ambassador Ravner, and I've been saying this for a long time. History has to be left to historians. And the problem is that the public doesn't understand that they don't have the tools to deal with these issues. And unfortunately, you can find guilty parties in both countries, including, sadly, and I say this with a heavy heart, here in Israel, including some very senior politicians who felt that they can reinsert into the discourse some very problematic stereotypes. And this, of course, is not helpful to our dialogue. So I think that's what we must recognize. In other words, relations between Israel and Poland will never, or at least not in the immediate future, be completely comparable to relations with other countries. And what's especially interesting is if we look at Israel's relations with all the countries of Europe, all of which have a tangled Jewish past, history generally doesn't pose the obstacle that it does. And we heard Ambassador Magierowski mention all the other countries of Western and East Central Europe, whether they're in what part of Europe we can discuss. But in the relations with those countries, even countries which have a very, once had a great Jewish population, which was murdered during the Shoah, this doesn't seem to be a kind of sticking point that it does with our relations. So I think that's what we have to face, and we have to figure out a way that we can move forward. And lastly, earlier in the call, I cannot remember now who was speaking about it. Perhaps it was our friend Ambassador Ben Zvi, whom I also have the pleasure for knowing for more years than I care to admit. I think we were both young and handsome then. What we are now, I prefer not to mention. When he was speaking about the different institutions who should be involved in any historical discussion, I would certainly say first and foremost has to be the Polish Center for Holocaust Research of the Polish Academy of Science, because the historians of that organization, and here I speak as a fellow historian, have really done pioneering work with tremendous courage and determination, and they must be a part of any dialogue. Finally, the last thing I want to say, and I always like to end on an optimistic note, but I think also if you look at some developments in Poland in very recent times, this doesn't bode well for the future. Just as an example, we know Poland has a new Minister of Education. I am very concerned what the message that the Ministry of Education will insert into textbooks going forward. And make no mistake, what appears in textbooks is going to influence successive generations. This is not a trivial matter by any means. So that's something that really has to be monitored. I think we have to work hard on this, but we must work on it.
Thank you very much. So as for now, we are sharing very similar fears, that's for sure. And that's a good starting point. The same question about obstacles to Professor Joanna Dyduch. If you could elaborate in just a few words.
Yes, of course. I will try to be brief as possible. Few points. In a way, this is a summary of what has been said before. First of all, the main obstacle is the politicization of the content of social, cultural, and people-to-people relation. So it applies very much to now to history, a common history narrative about a common history, education education about the common history, but commemoration. But it can apply to other realms of social and cultural relation between the states. So less politics is better than the purposeful politicization is something that might be that is an obstacle. The second thing is using the content of the social and cultural and historically rooted relation for the internal policy purposes. Sometimes very defined in a very short lasting interest, but just for a political campaign, electoral campaign, and so on. And this will we observed in Israel, and this we observed in Poland as well. So using the content of the relation, Polish-Israeli, Polish-Jewish relations for the internal political purposes. The second and the third thing, and the last one is, I think what has been said also here, Polish and Israeli political ruling elites are to some extent similar, and the way how they perceive the national community, the importance of state, and the importance of the security issues. I would say that this is the obstacle. This is the general obstacle.
I think we've lost.
Okay, I'm back. I hope that all is well. I just would say that this closeness or the similarities and the ideological character of Polish and Israeli ruling elites, governments, leaders is an obstacle. Why? Because this tendency to radicalization of national narrative, the presentation of liberal values versus national values, contra-national values, is a trend that is not helping in shaping cooperation and dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Duduk. And the last question, which I'd like to open to all the panelists, and to follow the idea of Dr. Weinbaum, to finish on a more optimistic note. If you are to name the common and strategic unifying objectives that Israel and Poland may have as of 2020, what would they be? Ambassador Magierowski, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry again. We could probably speak for hours on end about our common objectives. Let me just refer briefly to one particular area, namely security. The Middle East has always been a geopolitical powder keg, so to speak, with far-reaching global implications, from oil prices affecting worldwide economic trends, to Islamic terrorism, to subsequent waves of refugees. Poland has always been involved, more or less officially, in Middle East politics. Stability in this region is equally important for the political and economic stability of Europe, and by extension of Poland. Lower oil prices mean less burden for the overall economy. Less terrorism and ethnic strife mean less migrations. Therefore, Poland is very much interested in promoting peace in the region. As you all remember, and it was also mentioned by Ambassador Ben-Zvi, we hosted a Middle East conference in Warsaw in February 2019, which I believe was a milestone in the long-hatched process of the so-called normalization of ties between Israel and a number of Muslim countries. We agreed all those agreements signed recently by Israel with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. They are about to sign another one with Sudan. And of course, we are ready to assist Israel in its efforts to enhance the network of political and economic cooperation in the wider Middle East for a common good. So this could be a reasonable, if ambitious, common objective in the months and years to come. Thank you.
It sounds very ambitious, but I think we are both very ambitious in our undertakings. I would like to ask right now Ambassador Zvi-Ravner. You need to unmute first.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, as mentioned earlier, really the two governments and the two states have really quite many objectives in common in general foreign policy. Let me just highlight. We are, I think, in a very unique group nowadays of very close relations countries with the American current president. Maybe for one more week, I don't know. Really, I think that
it's an opportunity and threats at the same time.
If he is going to lose those elections, I'm afraid that both in Jerusalem and in Warsaw, there will be quite many people who will be very sorry for that. In this respect, we are really, I mean, Poland and Israel very close to each other. But it's, of course, I think your Polish relations and Israeli-American relations will survive any administration in Washington, because this is a very important interest for both countries, each one in its own interest indeed. but it's something that unites us in a way. Those special relations of both countries with the United States, even though you got already a free visa system with the Americans, we haven't yet, in spite of being so close to the administration there. But never mind. The most important thing is that they provided some normalization agreements with Arab countries, then moved their embassy to Jerusalem. Well, I hope that Poland maybe sometime will come, that Poland also will move its embassy to Jerusalem. But in any case, the same goes for Europe. I think with all the problems that Poland is having with Europe these days, also Israel's relations with Europe are not simple, are quite complicated in many ways. So it's again something that unites us. And those last 30 years, I think, demonstrated those close relations in the most important issues that we were having. Apart from whatever we've said about the historical and Jewish issues, indeed, there are obstacles. There are obstacles that they are not going away, unfortunately. But really, otherwise, and with any different government in Poland and any different government in Israel, those relations will continue because our countries are close. Whether because of the 1,000 years of joint history of Jews and Poles, I don't know, or maybe because of the interests of modern Poland, modern Israel, but they are close, and I believe that they will sustain and conquer any possible divisions in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now, Dr. Weinbaum, what are the hopes? We need you to unmute. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I think that the previous speakers have very well articulated the answers to that question. I think the only thing that hasn't been mentioned is the common secret weapon that we have, and that's the Polish mothers. Who we can never ignore in any such discussion. But I think certainly what Professor Dyduch has said, whether Poland will adopt a more European or an Atlanticist orientation is something very important. I think I completely concur once again. No, I'm not receiving any royalties from Ambassador Ravner. I think that when you if you were to draw a scorecard, both the Israeli and Polish sides have so much in common. And were it not for some of these niggling historical issues, the cooperation would be even deeper and there would be less common suspicion. But the fact that both of these countries, whether for better or worse, we won't get into that, identify themselves as countries with a very strong national ethos, and with a certain common idea and a common understanding. I mean, this is not a coincidence. If you talk to Poles who come to Israel and Israelis who come to Poland, they very often speak of feeling at home, each in the other's country, in a way that they don't feel in other parts of the world. I don't think that's a coincidence. So I do think there is a certain common, Weltanschauung or Pogląd na świat, I don't know what you want to call it, which bodes well for the future. But there are those challenges, because at the end of the day, sentiment is one thing, but national interest is another. But I think we can make a very strong case that there are very close national interests. The interests coincide between Israel and Poland. I just want to say one last thing in conclusion. What's very interesting is if I look at the evolution of my own thinking in the 1990s, I believed that as Poland would draw closer to the European Union, I thought that, for example, anti-Semitism in Poland would decline, thinking that the European Union would be a positive influence. And I've changed my thinking on that, because I don't think necessarily the European Union, at least in these matters, is necessarily the positive influence that we would have hoped it to be. So that's basically what I can say in a couple of moments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weinbaum. And Professor Dyduch, your take on the chances and opportunities? You need to unmute.
Yeah, I would say that I agree with everything that has been said, absolutely. And what can I add? Maybe some kind of alternative scenario. Let's think of really alternation of power in Washington, which can be the game changer. And I believe that Poland might find itself in a critical position in terms of its position in the EU and its Middle Eastern policy, which all diplomats with whom I recently talked, which I carried the interviews, were saying that Middle East is not a priority of Polish foreign policy due to the lack of resources, due to the other directions, mostly European and Eastern European and Western European. But it can become really a problem for Polish diplomacy if Trump wins, if Netanyahu decides to go on with the annexation of the West Bank or at least some parts of the West Bank, then Poland, then European Union will definitely will try to take a voice, to influence the situation, to play a role, and Poland may find itself in a very, very critical position, because differently than in Poland, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, which is already in Poland seen as an internal problem, not an external problem, not an international problem, for the Western European countries like Germany, German public opinion, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Ireland, Sweden, and so on. This is a top priority issue in the foreign policy agenda of the EU. So I would end with this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful and informed panel. Thank you for actually addressing the question, which is very commonly shown in the forum asked by our attendees, about what happens next if the elections in the United States goes the other way than they used to be going 5 years ago. That was probably the most common last question: what happens to the relations if President Trump loses his position? Thank you very much for your impact on the Polish-Jewish relations for those decades, and for sharing your perspective with us today. Thank you very much.